Good morning, everybody. A lot of what I'm going to say bears out what Susan was saying in the video. I'd like to just re-emphasize why you should be a fox, because foxes are the smartest animals around. Secondly, I'd like to show you what our latest economic scenarios for the global economy are, which bear out, again, much of what was said in the video. And thirdly, talk about the possibilities for South Africa. Chantal Ilbury and I wrote 3 books on foxes. The first one we called The Mind of a Fox, because we wanted to get across to people that there are so many things out there which are beyond your control, and that they are unpredictable, and therefore you have to prepare for that unpredictability, and it is your speed and quality of response to those changes in the environment that you don't control that actually ensure that you survive and grow. And we wanted to put this across because the mainstream idea punted by many American management experts is that you should have a vision, a mission statement, you should align everybody, you march collectively towards the vision. It's a control paradigm. I mean, Chantal and I have been doing some work with GE, particularly GE Capital, and I can tell you right now that their whole emphasis is on control and execution. And what 2008 did, the financial crash, was cause the kind of agitation that Susan was talking about. And so now they like to prepare for different scenarios. Well, that's what we feel foxy thinking is all about. The second book we wrote, we called Games Foxes Play, because business games change dramatically in 5 to 10 years. And you have to establish what those changes are in order to come up with the most effective strategy. I've just been doing some work in London with one of the largest credit card companies in the world. And it became quite apparent that you could see a huge change in payment systems over the next 10 years because mobile phones will become electronic wallets. I mean, it's already the case in places like Kenya. There's an M-Pesa scheme where you actually take your cell phone into a shop and it gets swiped. After you put in your code, your salary is actually loaded onto your cell phone. You can make transfers now to relatives in other countries. Goodbye, Western Union. You just do it with your cell phone. Here in South Africa, using a mobile phone to pay is being examined by Pick n Pay with Nedbank. And yeah, maybe in 10 years' time, a credit card will be like a check. Something you use very infrequently. So you have to, and particularly if you're in the IT field, you have to examine how the IT game is changing. I mean, for me, as an outsider, it's started out with the early adopters in the 1950s, like IBM. You had that incredible period growth in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The 90s, it began to mature, and now we're into a really mature phase of the IT game, where it is absolutely brutal competition. And you know, when you have such brutal competitions, people go to the wall, like Kodak. You just go to the wall. And I mean, Apple at the moment is seeing off both Nokia and RIM in the United States. Their market share of the two, RIM and Nokia, has fallen dramatically. It's not out of the imagination that in 2 or 3 years' time they'll actually disappear. So we're actually in a very different game in IT, and I'm sure the same applies to IT talent as well. The third book we wrote, we called Socrates and the Fox, because if the great Athenian philosopher had been alive today, he wouldn't have asked you about your budgets and your targets. He would have said, why do you exist? And is there anything happening to undermine the reason for your existence? And this has become quite a sharp question in light of the recession, because what we've come across, Chantal and I, around the world is a drive by the consumer for value for money and the cheaper alternative. And if companies offer that, they grow, and if they don't offer that, they die. I mean, it's now, no longer a case where if you have an unintelligent strategy, that you can just sort of go along because the whole world economy is growing, which you could do in the 90s. Now you have to be intelligent. I mean, just to slightly amend Susan's expression, Chantal puts it very elegantly. She says, we've moved from the age of information to the age of intelligence. Because information is now democratic. You can pick it up on your cell phone, you can pick it up anywhere. It's how you use that information that has become the most important thing. So, you've got to ask yourself, how are you offering value for money? I did a session with Spar International 2 days ago at Sun City. I hadn't realized that Spar, in fact, is an international supermarket chain in about 133 countries. They've actually grown their profits by 15% per annum over the last 3 years. And it's because in all the countries they're seen as value for money. I mean, I remember when I did a strategy session with Mr. Price down in Durban, one of the managers there saying there's no such thing as a high net worth housewife left in South Africa. So they all come to Mr. Price with their Edgar's bags, fill up. And that's why Mr. Price has also done extremely well during the recession. So one of the critical questions you have to ask yourself in a business is, what is my value for money? And if I want to actually beat the market in terms of price, what is my cheapest alternative? But I'd like to tell you about the global economic scenarios that Chantal and I are offering now, because again, they bear out this point about stagnation. I mean, the first scenario that we offer our clients, we call hard times. It's a Dickensian title to a book, and it's not a double dip, it's just flat, low, ugly growth for the next 5 years. And a lot of people find that very pessimistic. But we point to Japan. I mean, in 1988, we had a scenario planning session for Anglo in a place called Midhurst in England. It's in Sussex, at a 14th century pub called the Spread Eagle, because I felt that scenario planners think more clearly about the future with a bit of liquor inside them. And I remember at the beginning of this workshop, the legendary scenario planner of the second half of the last century, a guy called Pierre Wack, who was a Frenchman who headed up the team at Shell, saying, gentlemen, the 2 flags have gone up on Japan. I can promise you, in 1988, we felt about Japan the same way that we feel about China right now. It was unstoppable. So we said, Pierre, what are the 2 flags? He said, the first flag is declining golf club membership in Tokyo. He says that is an indication that there's something happening to Japanese disposable income, because they are golf fanatics, and if they're resigning in droves from golf clubs, there's something afoot. And he said it would suggest that it's going to be a smash next year. And then the second thing he said, the long-term flag, is demographics of Japan. It's an aging society. There's a geriatric boom going on. So yes, you can grow your pharmaceutical business or walking sticks, but not good for normal products. And then he said, based on those 2 flags, there's going to be a smash next year, and then there's going to be no recovery. It's not a U, it's not a W, it's an L. An endless L, he called it. And guess what? It's exactly what happened. Japan hit the wall in 1989, and they've never recovered. 22 years of sub 1% economic growth, having been 7 to 8% every year for 20 years before that. And yeah, it's a brutal world. They're on QE23. QE stands for quantitative easing. It's where you pump money into the system to try and generate enthusiasm for opening new businesses. And America is on QE3. Britain has just finished QE2. Well, Japan has QE23. It has a national debt to GDP ratio of 210%. It's the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world. They've had zero interest rates for 22 years. In fact, some years they've been negative. In other words, you pay the bank to put your money on deposit at the bank. And it still hasn't regenerated business activity like the 70s and 80s. So all these politicians around the world saying if you keep interest rates low, you will expand the economy. Not necessarily, because it didn't happen in Japan. Keynes, the great British economist, wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Money and Interest in 1936, in which he said what actually generates economic growth is animal spirits. It's nothing to do with reason. It's to do with entrepreneurs just having that enthusiasm, that vitality to open new businesses. And in many ways, just giving them credit is not going to work, because who wants to take on credit when they're fearful about economic conditions? It doesn't matter whether the interest rate is 0 or 10%. You just don't take on the extra loan. So the hard time scenario is a credible scenario given the level of indebtedness in Europe, the incredible crisis that there is now. I mean, Greece could well be leaving the Eurozone. I'm quite concerned as a holder of euros. Do I get drachmas? What actually happens? I don't know. And they talk about all the kind of unintended consequences of a Greek departure from the euro that nobody's worked out. And so, you know, it's not a good scene. And in that sense, I would say innovation is absolutely vital to grow your business. It's not just a reaction. It is absolutely essential in hard times to have an intelligent strategy. We don't just bet on that scenario. We offer our clients an alternative. It's called an ultraviolet time. What ultraviolet means is that the advanced economies in the world have the 5-year U, and the new world economies, such as China, India, Africa, South America, have a V-like recovery and grow 3 times faster than the old world economies. And I guess that's what many companies believe at the moment, because they're chasing the V. I did a session with Kraft Foods the other day at the Legends Golf Resort. They're the second largest food company in the world after Nestle. And we had an awards evening for their African distributors. The guy who won the overall award was an Angolan who tripled chewing gum consumption in Angola in 1 year. I don't know whether it was 1 to 3 people, but yeah. But the average growth rate achieved for the award winners in Nigeria, Ghana, Burundi, Rwanda, Mozambique, Zambia, was 60 to 70% growth in sales of cheese products and other things. Now, there's no way that you get that growth in sales in America or the UK. So American companies are all over Africa like a rash, chasing the V. And in that sense, Susan is probably right that in that scenario, you know, there is going to be a pickup in the South African economy. We at the moment give 40% probability to hard times and a 30% to ultraviolet, because we've gone slightly negative on China, because that is the flag between the two scenarios. If China continues to grow at 8 to 10% per annum, then all the countries that supply China will grow fast too. If China has the same kind of wobble that Japan had in the late 80s, then you know, it'll be hard times for everybody. And yeah, 2 things. 38% of China's GDP is exported, compared to 10% of America and 14% of Japan's GDP. Difficult for China to continue to grow if it's exporting into a flat Europe. And secondly, there's a lot of unoccupied property in Tier 2 cities in China, not Shanghai and Beijing, but in a lot of those other cities that have 15 to 20 million people that you don't know the names of. There are entire suburbs which are empty, where municipalities have borrowed money from Chinese banks to build these cities, and of course, there's no money coming in, and that could impact negatively on the Chinese banking system. So we give a 40% probability to hard times, 30% to ultraviolet. They're like two racehorses. They're almost side by side. We're watching China to see which one's ahead, and those are our two mainstream scenarios. But if you're a futurist, you have to look at the outsiders, what Malcolm Gladwell called the outliers as well. The incredibly positive scenario is that we're all wrong, and Ben Bernanke, who is the chairman of the Fed with his zero interest rates, is right, and that next year we'll see a full-blown recovery for everybody. We call that scenario new balls, please. if you've watched Wimbledon, when you play a new set, you get new balls. And we just feel that when the game recovers, that it will be a completely different game requiring new balls in two important respects. Number one, the East will be the economic equivalent to the West, which is huge, since the West has dominated the global economy for centuries. But the second reason is even bigger. The planet is finally running out of resources. As a friend of mine said, there is no planet B. So, there is a problem. I mean, just one statistic. If China ever reaches American lifestyle, you need 4 planets. Well, we haven't got that. And so in a recovery scenario, commodity prices will go through the roof. We tested out an energy consultancy in the UK on what the price of oil could go to in our recovery scenario. They said somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a barrel. Now, it's already high, petrol prices. They're biting into our disposable income. Can you imagine what a $500 oil price will do? It will just mean that you have virtually no money left for food. You won't drive to a distant shopping mall if it costs you 200 Rand to get there. You'll shop at a local 7-Eleven. All companies will look at their energy chains, how they can cut back on freight charges. I have to say New Zealanders are spooked by our scenario because they know that they will become uncompetitive because New Zealand is in the middle of nowhere compared to the markets that it serves. Solar energy will become a huge thing in this scenario. Indeed, in places like Germany and Australia, solar energy systems for households have become, a very common thing. And what's more, you can sell surplus energy beyond what you use for your own devices back to the grid. You become a miniature power station. So in this room, all of you will become miniature power stations, selling electricity to Eskom in 10 years' time. So it's a scenario that's worth exploring. It's got lots of different opportunities and threats attached to it. And we find it very interesting when we discuss it with companies. The last scenario, and sorry, we only give a 10% probability to that scenario because our principal flag is American unemployment. We'd like to see it in the 7s to say the largest economy in the world is in recovery. Right now, American unemployment is sitting at 8.3%. It's come down from 9.5, but it's still got to come down a lot more for us to say, hey, America's in a real recovery mode. The last scenario is the one we all dread, a double dip. The worst is yet to come. We call it forked lightning. You go down, you have a recovery, and then you seriously crash. We have a parallel, 1932. Everybody talks about the Wall Street crash in 29. It didn't. It went down in 29, it recovered in 30 and 31, and then it seriously crashed in 32. It went down to 11% of its peak value in 1929. So the equivalent today would be the Dow Jones falling from its current value of 11,500 to 1,500, and Americans losing between 80 and 90% of the wealth that they'd invested in the American stock market. Obviously, we had tested Americans on this scenario. We asked them 2 questions. Is it viable? Secondly, what are the flags? And firstly, they did say it was viable. And secondly, some of the best fund managers were unanimous about the flags. Number one is the 10-year the interest rate on 10-year US Treasury bonds, because they said that is the principal yardstick by which they measure foreign confidence in America. They said if that starts jumping to 4 to 5%, it'll mean that foreigners have lost faith in America, particularly China, and that will create huge problems for America. Well, the Treasury rate right now is about 1.8% because American paper is seen as safer than European paper. And so that flag is down at the moment. But the second flag they chose was a default by Italy, not Greece. Greece can be handled. 50% haircut, no problem. I love that word, haircut. It means you get 50 cents in every euro that you lent. And they said if the same happens to Italian bonds, that bondholders get 50%, it'll bankrupt virtually every single European bank and virtually every single European pension fund. So that's why what's going on in Europe is absolutely vital at the moment, because if contagion starts and it becomes unstoppable, and you see Italian and Spanish bonds heading up to 10% interest rates, even 20. I mean, Greece is now at 30%. Can you imagine that? The interest rate on a Greek 10-year bond is 30%. You know, then we are heading into forked lightning. And all you can do is go inside. You'll certainly have no problem with recruitment. And yeah, we give it a 20% probability at the moment, but it's something you've got to watch. I mean, that's the whole point of our technique. You watch the flags. You've got to be intelligent. You've got to choose the flags because there's so much information. What are the flags? And then you say, okay, that flag's going up. The probability is rising. This is what I'm going to do about it. You've got to connect the dots. What am I going to do about it? This is what I'm going to do about it. And of course, you know, come back into IT, and IT being the way companies can differentiate their intelligence. In that scenario, you've got to be incredibly intelligent to survive. So it's tough. I don't think I've seen in my lifetime as a business person as tough a market as we have at the moment. What about South Africa against that fairly sober global picture? Well, Sunter and I offer 3 scenarios to our South African clients. The first we call Premier League. It's where we stay in the Premier League of Nations, 59 nations that are annually ranked in a survey that comes out of Switzerland every May, called the World Competitiveness Yearbook. We've ranked somewhere between 35 and 40 for many years, because that's where we should be. We're the 32nd largest economy in the world. We're the only African country in the Premier League. But last year, we fell from 44 to 52 in 1 year. And the reason given was policy uncertainty deterring foreigners from investing in South Africa. And guess what? That's still around. So Sunter and I say, we're in the relegation zone of the Premier League. And there are 3 scenarios. The first is that we get our ducks in a row, and we get back into the middle of the league where we rightfully belong. The second is we don't get our ducks in a row, and we slide down into a scenario called second division. It's where the bulk of the third world lies, poor but peaceful. And yes, you will still make money in the second division, because companies make money in third world economies. But for the government, it'll be a disaster, because they won't get the tax revenue that they got in the Premier League, and they certainly won't have access to international capital. Just when Eskom needs another 500 billion rand for its next generation of power stations, and if you believe the figure, we need 750 billion rand to keep our water supplies sustainable. We could be kicked out of G20 in that scenario, because Nigeria is now 2/3 the size of the South African economy. It's growing at 7%, we're growing at 4%. It could overtake South Africa in the latter part of this decade. And yeah, they could even replace us on BRICS. It'll become BRINC. So not a good scenario for national morale. If the flag of violence goes up, we move into a scenario called failed state. It's where we join the likes of Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, where people turn their back on you because you're too unpredictable and you're too violent. Now, obviously, the level of violence here is nothing like it is in Syria at the moment, and we only give a 10% probability to that scenario. But we have 4 red flags and 1 tendency which we ask people to watch. Number 1, nationalization. It's not what we feel about nationalisation, it's what our major trading partners feel, and they all think it's a totally retrogressive policy. And their first question they ask is, how would the government here pay for the mines and the banks? I think the ANC has come to the same conclusion, which is why they're talking about a state-owned enterprise rather than wholesale nationalisation of the industry. And of course, the chief protagonist has left from the stage. Oh, Julius. So, yeah, we feel that flag is down at the moment, but we're watching this economic conference that is about to come up. The second red flag is a clumsy implementation of national health insurance, which leads to a decline in private medical care. Because we feel that a lot of young talent will leave this country because high on their list of priorities for themselves and their families is quality medical care. At the moment, the minister is in talks with the major players in the medical care, hospital, pharmaceutical industry, so we feel that flag is down because he's trying to implement NHI without having an adverse impact on private medicine. The third flag is partially up. It's a media tribunal with punitive powers. When the secrecy bill came before Parliament, we jumped failed state from 0 to 15% because we were really worried that it was going to gag the media. Certainly recent concessions have been made. The tribunal has been turned into a commission and there's a whistleblower clause. But there are other aspects to the legislation which is around which we don't like, such as all your incoming emails from overseas and your telephone calls can be monitored by the state. We think that's a terrible thing. It is the reason we now give a 10% probability to failed state. The last red flag is land grabs. Sunter and I did a session with ZANU-PF in February 2008. We didn't go up to Harare. They came down to Johannesburg, and we have a 2-day session at the Saxon Hotel. Not shabby. And yes, on the second day, one of the civil servants said something which opened both Chantal and my eyes. He said, in retrospect, the land invasions in Zimbabwe were a mistake. He said, we had an economy growing at 7 to 8% for most of the decade in the 90s. We were the fastest growing SADC economy. That first land invasion, we didn't slow down, we hit the wall. And in South Africa, we'll hit the wall. We'll be immediately equated with our neighbour to the north. And the whole point of putting that flag on the table is to say to people, how are you going to keep it down? And that's why Chantal and I are calling for an agridessa, which is an agricultural equivalent to the CODESA we had in the early 90s, where you bring the major players in the agricultural game, the big farmers, the emerging farmers, the government, the land bank, the unions, together to develop a proper program for transformation of land ownership in this country. The tendency comes out of 2 sessions I recently did in Pretoria with Western embassies. I asked both of them, did you miss the Arab Spring? And they both said yes. So I said, what was the flag you missed? And they said, abnormally high youth unemployment in all the countries affected by the Arab Spring, combined with growing alienation by young people from society, combined with active social networks. Guess what? We have all 3 in South Africa. So we're one random event away from our own version of the Arab Spring. And the question is, how do we keep that flag or tendency from turning into a reality? What are we going to do in the short term to dramatically reduce youth unemployment? Personally, I do like the incentives for big business to take on young people. I'd like to see a national community service scheme. I'd like to see labour legislation relaxed on small business so that they can take on young people. There's a whole bunch of things we can do to bring down youth unemployment. We give that scenario 10%, we put it on one side, and we're left with Premier League, second division. And we have 3 flags that we ask people to watch. Number 1, inclusive leadership. We looked at nations that have gone up the Premier League, and it's because they have leaders which make minorities and majorities feel part of the same team. It's the same with soccer. I mean, it's hard for me to say this as a Chelsea supporter, winner of the Champions League. But Manchester United has the best manager. Alex Ferguson keeps Manchester United united. Even when Rooney wants to bugger off, he brings him back. Same with rulers. I always quote Lee Kuan Yew, who in Singapore, he turned it into a very proud country, put a huge emphasis on education, law and order. Singapore last year was ranked number 3 in the Premier League, just behind America and Hong Kong. I'm afraid to say at the moment, you can't say we have inclusive or exclusive leadership, because it would appear that we don't have leadership. I mean, we have paintings. But we don't, I mean, we just seem to be kind of, we seem to be drifting at the moment. And of course, this whole contest in December is very, very important as a flag. What is going to happen in December when we have the leadership contest for both the ANC and obviously the next presidential candidate? The second flag is around pockets of excellence. This country has incredible pockets of excellence. How are we going to use those pockets of excellence to raise our performance? What we mustn't do is dumb down our pockets of excellence. I've always said government has one pocket of excellence. SARS, the South African Revenue Service, is as good as any revenue collection agency anywhere in the world. In fact, the head of IT at the American Embassy says that SARS has the slickest system for citizens to pay tax on the internet of any country in the world. How do we spread that brilliance to other countries? Schools. We have 28,000 schools in this country, of which 5,000 are reasonable to excellent, and 23,000 are dysfunctional to shocking. How are we going to take the 5,000 schools and use them as a model to raise the other 23,000? I mean, having run the Anglo-American Social Responsibility Fund for 12 years, my belief is that the principal variable of a school is the principal. You want to have a good school, you choose a good principal. It's as simple as that. I mean, I could tell within 30 seconds of interviewing a principal for a school whether I was going to give money to that school or not. 30 seconds, 2 questions, and you knew. And it means we should have a principals academy in South Africa, and we should have 5-year contracts, where if they don't perform, they get kicked out. The third flag is around creating a balanced economy, an outward economy that earns us foreign exchange, an inward economy that creates jobs. As far as the outward economy is concerned, you have to play to spaces you can dominate, and we have 3 spaces we can dominate. Number 1 is resources. Despite the decline in gold and diamond production, we're number 1 in platinum, chrome, manganese, iron ore. We've just got to add some value to them. The second is tourism. I mean, we are a very cheap destination now, and we've never built on the success of the World Cup, where we actually did come together for 1 month. And then we fell apart the following day. I mean, I was on a flight from Johannesburg to Cape Town the other day at lunchtime. It was a 747, and I was the only non-Chinese passenger. So it was obviously a very large party on their way from Beijing to see the penguins in Simonstown. So how do we build on that? The third space is being the gateway into Africa. I know it's a sort of tired expression, but it's so true. American companies, as I said, are all over Africa like a rash. We're the obvious place for them to start their campaign into Africa, because we've got all the banking systems, the IT systems for American companies. And Walmart is the first to realize that. On the inward economy, there's just one flag. But if you remember anything from today's presentation, it is the most important thing to remember. It is our attitude to entrepreneurs and small business. We looked at the 2 largest economies in the world, America and China. And whilst they're totally different, they share a passion for entrepreneurship. I had lunch with a young lady the other day whose father is on the Politburo of the Chinese state. I mean, it is the top executive body in China. And she said to me, she said, the one thing Westerners completely miss about China is that when Deng Xiaoping came in, he totally liberated the Chinese economy. And she says, right now, outside of Shanghai and Beijing, there is, and I quote her directly, economic anarchy. And yeah, I mean, that's turned them into the second largest economy in the world from being number 100 in 1978. They just released the entrepreneurs. And I have a friend who's just come back from Lagos. He says the future of Africa is not Johannesburg, it's Lagos, because of the entrepreneurial frenzy you find in Lagos associated with a fairly unregulated environment there. Here in South Africa, we have an ambivalent attitude to entrepreneurs. I mean, some people feel they shouldn't exist because they're grubby little capitalists. And yeah, I mean, Trevor Manuel said the other day, 90% of the jobs to be created by 2030 to bring our unemployment down to 6% will be in small business. So I feel like saying to him, duh, why didn't you make the entrepreneur the centerpiece of your National Planning Commission report? You know, the entrepreneur was sidelined. It's all about infrastructure and infrastructure development programs. Actually, it's about entrepreneurs and small business. Jacob Zuma, instead of saying we're going to create 5 million jobs by 2020, should have said we're going to create 1 million new businesses by 2020, because that is the only way you're going to create 5 million jobs. Big business isn't going to do it. I mean, when I was on the executive committee of Anglo American, we had 450,000 employees in all our businesses in South Africa. In my own division, which I was chairman of, Gold Division, we had 230,000 employees. The entire staff of Anglo American right now is 91,000. There's no way that we're going to get back to anywhere close to 450,000, because we're now subcontracting all our non-core activities to other businesses. Government isn't going to employ another 5 million civil servants. It hasn't got the money. And public works programs are a temporary solution. So, logically, it's all about small business and certainly simplifying the labour legislation so that small businesses can take on more people. I mean, Chantal and I would immediately take on an extra 20 people if we were allowed to hire and fire at will, but we're not prepared to spend 5 years in a labour court fighting over something when we should be out there consulting. We're not going to do that. And equally, obviously, you've got to provide better means of finance, and you've got to have mentorship. The grey foxes, the silver grey foxes, providing advice to entrepreneurs. Nevertheless, we give a 50% probability to staying in the Premier League and a 40% probability to dropping into the second division. If you add the 40 and the 10, we're now 50-50 between the positive and the negative scenarios, and Chantal and I call that a second tipping point. The first tipping point was in the early 90s, when we could have tipped into civil war, but we didn't. We had CODESA 1, CODESA 2 to negotiate a new constitution. We now need an economic CODESA to actually build a new economic blueprint. There is one incredible expert, I can't remember his name, on Africa, and he said the most dangerous moment in the liberation of a company is not when it starts, it's after 10 years, when reality sets in. And reality has just set in, and I can promise you, if we don't have an economic CODESA, we could have our own version of an Arab Spring. I'd like to end up with one story about one pocket of excellence, because it's a very important flag. I was the chairman of the Anglo-American Scholarship Panel for 25 years. We interviewed the brightest students in South Africa for one open scholarship to university. And in 2008, we interviewed the brightest student we've ever had in front of our panel. This guy was 17 years old. He got 8 straight A's in matric when he was 16. He got a scholarship to St. John's College, private school up the road, when he was 15. He comes from Mthatha, and his name is Siubelela Zuza. And the question we put to him is, what degree have you chosen and why? He said, I've chosen chemical engineering at UCT, and the reason is I developed this passion for chemicals when I was 12 years old. I started mixing them in my mother's kitchen, causing minor explosions to our utter dismay. And then I focused on a product, which was to create a rocket fuel that was more energy intensive than the stuff NASA uses to propel its rockets into outer space. It took me 2 years. I cracked the formula, assembled a South African team. We built a rocket. I put in my fuel. We beat the South African amateur altitude record. The project was entered into the Eskom Science Expo for that year. We won not only the award for technical innovation, we also won the award for the best project of the year. He was 16 when he won these awards. He says one of the prizes was to be sent to Sweden to meet the King and Queen of Sweden and to attend the Nobel Prize-giving ceremony. And the opportunity arose there to enter the largest junior science competition in the world, which is held annually in America under the auspices of Intel. Not only did I win 2 awards in that competition, the organizers were so impressed by my field that they sent it to the Lincoln Laboratory, which is affiliated to NASA, who promptly named a minor planet after me. I mean, how many of you in this room know that a 17-year-old black South African from Umtata has a minor planet named after him by NASA for the advances he's made to rocketry science? Very few. We all know Julius. Now comes the crunch. 3 months after we awarded him the scholarship, he comes running up to me at ORT and says, "Hey, Mr. Sunter, remember me?" I said, "See, I'm never going to forget you. How's UCT?" He says, "You haven't heard?" So I said, "No." He says, "Harvard University have awarded me an open scholarship, and I'm going there in the fall." He's in his 4th year at Harvard. He's doing chemical engineering. He has an outstanding academic record. At the second last launch of Endeavour space shuttle last year, he was the official guest of NASA and shown around the entire facility with 2 other guests, Barack and Michelle Obama. When Michelle Obama came out here last year, the US government flew him out to do the speech in her honor at the embassy in Pretoria. In America, he's a superstar. Here, he's a nobody. I mean, we had another incident yesterday. At 1 o'clock yesterday morning, the first commercial space flight took place. It was headline news in America. It was all done by a guy who got matric at Pretoria Boys High. He's called Elon Musk, M-U-S-K. Not one South African newspaper yesterday had him on the front page. They did have articles sort of halfway through, but it was all about the painting. Unreal. And it speaks volumes for the difference between American culture and South African culture. In America, they celebrate individual excellence because they know that that's what their future exists on. All we do is celebrate heroes of the past, not heroes of the future. I mean, one of my great heroes is Steve Biko, because he said it first. He said, handouts do not improve your self-esteem. Doing it for yourself does. And right now we have 15.5 million people on welfare out of a population of 50 million and 5.5 million taxpayers. That is not sustainable. We have to offer young people a quality education so they have the competence to do their own thing. We've got to give them the entrepreneurial space so that they have the freedom to do their own thing. And we're going to have to use icons like Sia so that they have the confidence to do their own thing. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. It totally backs up what Susan has said, that you have to be smart as a business. We call it, as I said, the age of intelligence. You have to be smart. So obviously, in the world of IT, you have to add to the intellectual firepower of a business. We have a book. It's available outside. It's called The Fox Trilogy. It's got all 3 of our books in one book. Very happy to sign it for you, but I highly recommend a rare unsigned copy. But if you want to buy it, it's by the door. There is a website, mindofafox.com, but I would ask you to Google just the word mind and fox, because everywhere in the world we are number 1. In fact, Google now rate us in the top 5 strategy websites in the world. I think we had 180 million hits in the last 6 months. And yeah, they did slightly take the gloss off, because they said half your hits, Mr. Sunter, are probably men in search of foxy women. But what the hell? In America, if you Google Mind Fox, we're number 1 and Megan Fox is number 2. So I feel very good about that. On the global economy, it's tough. I mean, it is really, really tough. But if you are intelligent, you can grow your business. And obviously, being intelligent does mean having those audacious ideas, and it does mean having talent in your team. In South Africa, we're still in the Premier League, but we must now do everything to keep the red flags down. And finally, I'll end with a benediction for all of you in this room and the businesses you represent. May the fox be with you. Thank you.